Well, first of all, I believe that the influence that I've been able to have on students has been profound, not because it's me, but because it's the instrument. To hear this music properly played, that is, the sounds being what they are in relation to this historic parameter that we have been discussing, affects the student ability, even if you're having to play it on a synthesizer. If you have a better idea of what the original is, then you have a closer idea to approximating that. So that even though you can't play literally the same music, composers like César Franck or Vierne or Widor, hear like you can in a French cathedral, you can come much closer to that sound than if you didn't know what it was. If somebody hands you a cupboard full of ingredients and tells you to make an angel food cake, and the first thing you do is throw in the whole egg, never having tasted angel food cake in your life, you've already ruined the whole recipe because the egg yolks don't belong there. And so not only does it then focus the student and give them the opportunity to hear this literature in ways that they perhaps will always be frustrated because it's rare. I can think of half a dozen instances where students have been able to influence new organs, and based on their experience here, those new organs are vastly superior than they would have been without this experience. Over the years, we've been privileged to have, I've never counted them. Numbers aren't things that are important to me, but I imagine that the number is in excess of 100. And when I retired from my 25th, when I retired after nearly 40 years of teaching, my wife and I were able to contact virtually 90% of my students because, first of all, you spend a lot of time one-on-one with them and are able to do a great deal of communicating. But yes, its influence has been great. There are those who object to the limitations that this presents, and therefore look for some of the other dimensions of flexibility. But we've already talked about flexibility does not mean musicality. Building a monster organ might give you lots of different sounds, but in the same process you've also sacrificed certain dimensions. The business of balance I'd like to let you hear, which I think is a really revealing thing. Each of the divisions has basic stops which we refer to as the chorus. And they differ from division to division. The pedal obviously is the biggest division. The main manual division the secondary division is smaller, only slightly softer. And the third division is tinier yet, more intimate, but not very much softer. So that certain pieces of music make contrasts with that, and Bach borrowed this directly from the orchestra. And the difference of those sounds. Modern devices came about very early on, and we call them couplers, and they allow you to play all of the divisions, each one respectively stacking up, if you will, on top of the other. So while I can play this sound and this sound, I can couple them together, and now I'm literally playing on both sounds at the same time. Or all three together. Which means that you can play the entire instrument with your feet. To answer your question again specifically, yes, it's had a great influence. And once the student experiences this sense of balance and clarity and the integral relationship of the divisions, you can't forget. As to the balance, let me play a fragment of a fugue of J.S. Bach, and play it first of all. It's in the middle of the Fantasy and Fugue in G minor, and play it first of all where Bach wrote it. Now, let's play both parts an octave lower. You still hear each part doing its thing. Both parts an octave higher. One hand lower, one hand higher. You still hear both parts completely. And I could do that with all three of the divisions. Won't take time to do that to demonstrate. But let's do this. Let me simply cross hands. You still hear all the parts. There's a kind of independence in the voicing that allows all of those individual registers of the organ to speak with great independence and clarity. And that being this balance being the most important musical dimension, then it works for virtually all of the literature. And believe me, there are few organs in the world that can do that.
So in moving this organ now, I look at the door and I look at the size of those 16-foot pipes. how is that going to work?
Well, it's going to work by...
Or maybe we could back up by saying this organ is about to be moved to a new space.
Yes. And the moving thereof is worrisome, but certainly not impossible. I saw the organ after nearly 2 years of design on paper and in consultation with Mr. Phelps about various dimensions. It was now finished at the factory and about a month away from being packed up and shipped to Fort Collins. And so I flew up to Montreal, outside of Montreal at St. Hyacinthe, and saw the organ standing just like it is in a room they call the erecting room, which is where they put the organ together first. And it was identical in every way except that the case was in natural wood. They hadn't finished it yet. They were waiting to dismantle it, and when it was dismantled, then they were going to do the final finishing of the oak. The organ played in completely there, and after making a few very minor changes that we discussed when I was there, the instrument was dismantled pipe by pipe, packed in huge cases, one of which we stored our Christmas tree in our garage, because obviously the cases were big enough to hold the biggest pipes. They had to be stored very carefully, and the pipes were sent after the instrument was, the mechanics of the instrument were shipped. And when they came, they did as much as they could possibly do to stand everything upright so that they didn't squash each other, because unfortunately pipes, and you can tell that from the couple of dents in some of them where the grand pianos have been run into. The pipes are made of a very high tin content. There's very little tin, by the way, in a tin can. And the tin is relatively soft, and therefore has to be treated very, very carefully. So as to the moving, this is not something that we can just hire 3 men and a boy to drive their truck up and throw all this stuff in a truck and haul it away. It's literally going to have to be packed as though it were going clear across the country, as it was in the first place. And then the mechanism is fairly substantial. In fact, it's very, very substantial. There are steel beams inside. It all fits together very much like a Lego set. All the parts are marked and clearly indicated. And the most critical thing is the pipe work, because the instrument is built in a style which makes all of the adjustment of the sound right at the mouth. This is atypical because very often the toes are also closed, which control the flow of air. And a very quick and simple analogy is you may open your valve on your garden hose completely, but if you have an adjustable nozzle at the end, you can get just the tiniest trickle. That doesn't change the fact that you've got a tremendous amount of pressure behind it, but you do have a dimension of control there. There is no dimension of control because the idea is to, in this kind of an instrument, is to have maximum transference of the changes of air pressure from one pipe to the other. Thus, this remarkable sensitivity, and what you do at one affects all of them. Because they're all being winded by the same valve. Most organ builders do not understand this kind of organ voicing, and therefore who moves it is exceedingly important, because that dimension is absolutely critical. What happens with pipe speech is, as you can tell by observing, the norm of the pipes are what we call flue, F-L-U-E pipes. And that means that the air enters the foot like an ice cream cone that you've bitten off the end of. And right at the top of the cone is a piece of metal welded on the top of that canonical shaped foot. As you look at the mouth of the pipe, you can see that upper surface, and we call that the languid. Organ builders were always at a loss for words, and so they simply borrowed anatomical terms. And that languid, and you can see it particularly in the big pipes, is tapered backward slightly. And the physical effect is that as air comes through the tiny flue, which is the space between the languid and the foot of the pipe, it produces a thin sheet of air which blows across the orifice. Now, we've experienced driving down the highway with our window partly open at 70 miles an hour, and you start to get this vibration. And it's the same thing that happens here. What happens, though, is that languid, because it's tapered backward, is the same physical effect as when you gently have a stream of water coming out of the faucet, and you put your finger by it and let the water follow the contour of your finger. And obviously, you can deflect the flow of the water simply by moving your finger, because the tendency of the water is to follow the contour of your finger, and therefore you can. So what happens here is that the tendency of the airstream, because of the languid, is to be pushed into the pipe. Now, because the pipe is not a hose, but open at the top, what begins to happen is that there's a compression of air from the top to the bottom. Newton's third law of physics, for every action there's an opposite and equal reaction, and the pressure begins a wave which goes in opposite directions. Now, because it's not a hose, the air doesn't just blow through the pipe. There's a certain point at which the air within the column says, hey, you've pushed us far enough, I don't have to go any further, and it begins to resist. And so it goes the opposite direction, and as it does that, that airstream that's coming out of the flue is deflected outward. Then equalization takes place, the pressures change, the force of the air being pulled inward takes over, and the cycle begins. And at this pitch, A440, that oscillation takes place 440 times per second. Now, we only hear that as pitch. But if you get it down very low, you can almost begin to hear the vibration. And indeed, when you get way down here, you can hear them almost as individual pulses. And that's particularly noticeable with this rank of pipes, which has a reed in the base and vibrates, but it's vibrating at about 16 cycles per second. And you can quite literally hear the flapping of the reed. The space of the flue, the height of the upper mouth are the only adjustments that this kind of pipe can have on it. And so in order to get this sound and this sound to sound similar is a very, very time-consuming thing, because it has to do with how open that flue is, how high up the upper lip is, and so on and so on. We call this process voicing, and the voicing is absolutely essential, because once the pipe is made and you blow into it, it doesn't necessarily speak. All these other dimensions have to be correct, and to match each of these sounds, not only in characteristic, but in speech characteristic. Now we're talking about subtleties, but as Lawrence Phelps used to say, if you compromise the subtleties in art, what is there left to compromise?
Two questions. Okay, go ahead.
This is called the Casavant organ. Could you explain where that name comes from and why?
Yes, Casavant is the name of the factory that built them. And they were a Canadian firm that had been in business for nearly 100 years. And they were building organs very typical of the day, phenomenally excellent in quality, but reflecting the tonal dimensions of size and a lack of characteristic of pipe speech and so on, and all electric action. It was a revelation to Casavant, because they are about as far from Montreal as we are from Loveland, when the St. Joseph Oratory in Montreal commissioned a German organ builder to build an organ for the big St. Joseph Oratory that sits on Mont Royal, the Royal Mountain in Montreal. And it was a very big job, a very prestigious position, And the fact that it didn't go to a Canadian neighbor and was in fact commissioned by the organist to be built in Germany was a real insult to Casavant. And it caused them to wake up and recognize that they better get with it or else lose out. And they hired Lawrence Phelps to take over and build organs with mechanical action. So we refer to this as a Phelps Casavant, but the point of the organ builder is exactly analogous to an architect. It doesn't matter who makes the stained glass or who makes carves the statues or who cuts the stone. The end result is the effect of the mind of the architect. And so the people who soldered the pipes and put in the screws for the wood and so on were only secondary to the importance of the mind of the builder of Lawrence Phelps that guided it. But it was Lawrence, and incidentally, like Bach is frequently referred to as a fusion of national styles, excuse me, this instrument is really a fusion of national styles. Lawrence Phelps was a Bostonian, an American. He had studied conducting, then studied organ building all over the world. Most of the workmen are French-speaking Canadians, and it was a Canadian firm that did the sawing of the wood and so on and so on. And so it really truly is a fusion of national styles. But it was focused by Lawrence Phelps. And we have at St. Luke's here in Fort Collins, Opus 1, which is the first organ after about 300 organs that Lawrence Phelps built, but it's the first one that bears his name because he was independent of Casavant. But the builder is, in a sense of secondary importance, unless it comes with great traditions, and clearly the people who knew how to make these pipes were smart enough to understand what Mr. Phelps was talking about and to produce them.
We pause for a second. Other areas.
It has indeed, it was installed in 1968, and the first major international artist to play was a man named Anton Heiller, who returned 5 times to play. He was the giant and still referred to with great affection. He sat down, improvised on the organ. He had never played a mechanical action Casavant. And we were very anxious about his response. He improvised on it for about 45 minutes and turned around and he said, I simply must say it is a positively remarkable organ. This is a person who played all of the other great organs in the world, really, in his lifetime. He spoke often of the instrument, and even at one of his concerts, I was almost embarrassed by the fact that he was going on and on with we had members of the State Board of Agriculture, and Bill Morgan and Ray Chamberlain were there, and he was talking about this instrument and how he was Viennese, came from the city of music, and even that city did not have an organ of this quality, and how grateful Bill Morgan and Ray Chamberlain should be that I guided the university to buy it. Through a succession then of international, some American organists. E. Power Biggs was here, played 4 times in this room. He was the most famous, I suppose, of American organists of the mid last century. Through their experiences, they talked about it. And I just had the privilege, my wife and I, of being at Marie Claire Allen's 80th birthday. She is the premier French organist and has taught virtually most of the organists in the world. And there were about 100 people invited at this celebration. And I would bet that about 50% of them asked about the organ. They all knew about this instrument, had heard rumors about it being moved and so on. After that, we were a week in Denmark at the 200th anniversary of the Markussen organ firm. They built the organ at the Methodist Church. Lawrence Phelps was no longer around when we built that organ, so I went to then suggested that we go to Denmark because of this great tradition of 200 years. And there were 172 organists there, and most of them had been here or have known of this instrument. So it really has had great influence. I'm sure it's far better known in Europe than it is in Greeley.
How important is it then? Talk about how it's important to, you've got 800 plus years of organ literature. You've got this organ now that has sustained this reputation. How important is it now that it has a successful move and that CSU continues?
I think it's not unlike moving the Mona Lisa from one art gallery to another. When it gets to the next place, you don't want something like the Mona Lisa that was in the Louvre. You want the Mona Lisa. And so it's absolutely critical that the instrument be moved by a firm that does not want to impose its own imprint on the instrument, and that does all they can possibly do to maintain the artistic integrity of the instrument. You know, it wouldn't take very long to a couple of dabs of paint put on the Mona Lisa to destroy its quality. And every single one of these pipes must be restored and revoiced as closely as possible to the intent of Lawrence Phelps.
Could you say that part again? I know the cell phone buzzed in the background, but the idea that it's important that whoever is selected to move it has the integrity and understands what exactly it is they're moving.
Yes, I'd be very happy to expound on that. The importance is that, first of all, this is a relatively large organ in a relatively small space. So it was designed specifically for this room to seat 200. The new room will seat 300. Lawrence Phelps saw the new room, was very excited about it, felt that the scale was not disproportionate, but an analogy which immediately would be obvious is if you have a very fine, small stereo that you use in your living room and try to play it in Moby Jim, you recognize that immediately there's a disproportionate demand on the instrument, which is guided by the fact that it was designed for a small space. And so this has been designed for a small space, and it can't go, we couldn't move this organ into Moby Jim. The scale is all wrong. So the intimate involvement in the design must be highly respected by the person who moves it, and the subtle natures of voicing and the pipework have to be understood and respected so that the original integrity of the instrument is maintained as much as possible. There's no doubt that the change of the acoustics of the new room will have some effect on the instrument, but the norm is that organ builders are given a space and they adapt the instrument to the space. We've got the exact opposite situation where the instrument is already here and now we've got to adapt, make sure that the room is as receptive as can possibly be to the instrument, and that the organ builder who does the moving is not interested in creating a new version of this organ, but rather, as much as possible, maintains its integrity. And in my opinion, there are precious few people who are capable of this.
I think that's the story we need to tell. Would you mind if Brian got some footage of you playing a bit?
I would be happy to.
Do organists have nicknames for their organs?
I don't think so.
Okay, so there's no nicknames that you would refer to this organ as? It would be called by its manufacturer name? Its
Yeah,
owner's name?
CSU Casavant.
Casavant?
How Bach took advantage of the respective divisions. Are we ready?
Yeah, ready.
and so on. Let's go to a completely different style and move ahead several hundred years and play a little bit of a Brahms chorale prelude and listen to the lush sounds that are capable from this instrument, in spite of the fact that we're now talking about North German music from the mid-1900s, Johannes Brahms. Moving ahead again, and also to a different country, play a bit of French romantic music, and hear how this North German organ handles that. French-like romantic sounds, the compromises we talked about earlier. For years, we heard broadcast from Temple Square in Salt Lake City, the end of the Mormon Tabernacle business, and I love to tease my Mormon friends by making this sound like the Mormon Tabernacle organ. So while it makes very bright, sparkly sounds of earlier music, this is an Italian piece called an offertory by Domenico Zipoli. Also illustrates that pedal tone that I was telling you about. Zipoli put his foot down on low C. And over it. Yes. Yeah, you want to go over and do what you just did,
Okay.
because the two biggest pipes are in fact in the back, if you look.
Okay, I see, right. And it,
Hold on one second. Could you start over?
Sure.
Okay, go for it.
You're very welcome.
Will you, can you make that happen again? The motion with the the stops?
oh, the one button that pushes all the stops.
Oh, yes, sure.
Cancels all the stops, right?
Yeah, there are this instrument has what was the best in 1966, the most reliable, which were these setter boards. And while they look very complicated, they correspond to two separate functions. One is 6 pistons, which we call these pistons, which allow you, and if your hands are busy, you can do those respectively with your feet. Obviously, this was not possible in 1720.
If you could do that a couple more times, please.
Sure. And you can change those combinations according to the pieces that you're playing. Then there are 6. This keyboard, it will only affect stops in that area, or stops in this area.
Could you reach up and move some of those manually?
Sure.
Yeah, and then the one right there, perfect.
Was easily sold to the executive vice president and Dr. Bill Morgan. And the dilemma, if you will, was that an organ could be built with electric action, which would have been more normal in those days. But this was a bit of digression, obviously, returning to the old historical practices. And it was easily understood that mechanical action gave one control over the instrument that was not possible with electric action. You can nuzzle up to your light switch in the bathroom and be as gentle or as rough with it as you wish, but the effect is always the same. The light's either on or off. And that was a problem with electric action. You push the key, and first of all, the action is slow. And secondly, this is not controllable. There is no dimension of control of pipe speech. Now, all of this is, no pun intended, an organic totality, and the instrument, you know, if these pipes were put on electric chests, the organ wouldn't sound at all like it does now. If pipes that were voiced for an electric chest were put in this instrument, the organ wouldn't sound the same. I mean, it depends on all of those things. But let me quickly demonstrate, and perhaps this will help us more than anything else, the effect of mechanical action. This instrument has a single valve underneath each note. So since there are 56 keys on each keyboard, there are 56 valves for each of these 3 divisions and 32 for the pedal. And they are directly mechanically connected by means of a little slot of wood we call a tracker. Thus, the organs are sometimes referred to as having tracker action. And the point is that how you push the key is directly related to how the palate underneath the pipe opens. And seated, if you stand in any position and look at the division, you see all the pipes are directly in line with each other because the chest is built, first of all, as a box that contains air under a specific pressure. On top of that box is a series of long valves, they vary in length, of course, depending on how much air has to get through, but they're relatively narrow, about less than an inch, have felt over them. They sit over a hole, and they are hinged at the back. And the back pulls down directly, mechanically, by means of a series of levers connected ultimately to the key. So that as you play the keys, the minute you break open the tiniest space, you affect pipe speech. It's instantaneous. So you really truly are playing the instrument. I mean, it's depending on you. And if you did that to an electric action organ, we would have had silence at the end of my glissando from one end to the other. It simply would not have spoken that rapidly. The second dimension is that the speed with which you open the valve, if everything is right, directly affects how the pipe speaks. And now we're back to the analogy of how you drop the bow on the string, how much consonant sound you put into your voice before you begin to sing, the sustained vowel tone, the point of woodwind sound, the attack of the lips on a mouthpiece for the brass instruments, et cetera, et cetera. And those are all musical dimensions which are absolutely essential to musical control. If you put the tip of the bow at the top on the string, gently turn to the side and have only a few hairs touching the string, and then gradually increase the sound and the pressure and so on, you get one kind of sound. If the bow is in fact in motion and you drop it very close with the weight onto the string, you get a completely different attack. And this has nothing, by the way, to do with necessarily with volume. So the obvious analogy is that if you have, even if this is Yo-Yo Ma or whatever great cellist you have, and you have 2 cellos and 2 violins, and Yo-Yo Ma is going to play the viola part, no matter how sensitive he is, no matter how nuancy he can be, the one thing he cannot do is make the cello sound like a viola, because the basic size of the instrument is already predetermined by the nature of the instrument. Therefore, the relationship of one pipe to another depends directly on the diameter of the pipe. And the length of the pipe determines pitch, but the diameter in relation to the length determines the weight of the sound. Thus, a double bass can play notes as high as violins, but clearly the size of the sound is different than that of a violin, simply because the body of the instrument is different. So that's the essence, really, of great organ building, is to understand the interrelationship. And in this instrument, there are 1,094 separate pipes, and the organ builder simply has to understand in advance what that relationship and proportion is, so that the sound characteristics can balance.
Can you demonstrate that?
Yes, I can. Before we do that, though, let's demonstrate the effect of the mechanical connection. If I play any note and play it very quickly, well, first of all, I guess you would be interested to know, the top millimeter is the most important part of it, because that's the part that opens up, begins immediately to open up the valve. The speed with which that occurs, if the pipes are properly voiced, affects the attack, which we can think of really as the consonant sound before the sustained vowel tone. So if I just do that, kind of wah opens up. If I do that, you hear it's very percussive in sound. It in fact sounds very much like a xylophone almost as the hammer hits the instrument. But with mechanical action, you can control that so that you have very legato attack, or can increase that. And organists who aren't used to playing these kinds of instruments, of course, are immediately disturbed by this fact that their fingers are making, are producing results that they've never heard before, and it's a bit scary. That's why you practice, obviously. But so much so that because all the pipes are winded by and they sit above this long key channel, sort of like a tie box on end, with the single valve underneath it. What you do to the one pipe, or what you do to the one valve, affects all the pipes in the division. So that if I play, now they're all drawn. And it's like having all the violins of the orchestra being controlled by a single bow. So that each of the divisions has its own independent attack, and all the pipes that are sitting right on top of that box respond in the same way. Now, the other part of the action are these stops, and basically what happens above that valve and above that key channel is a sandwich of 3 boards, and the organ builder drills directly through all 3. If you move the middle of our sandwich like a piece of Swiss cheese, if all the holes in the top of the bread and at the bottom of the bread line up with the hole in the cheese, we now have space and air can go through, or you can blow through them. All you have to do is shift the piece of cheese a slight bit, and even though there's a hole at the bottom and a hole at the top, air can't get through. So these devices are called stops, and they literally stop the air from going into the pipe. So the early instruments had no stop action and made a big sound sort of like this. Well, then organists and organ builders began to get creative and figure out how to take this architecture of sound and shut off parts of it. So it's like having your choir now reduced to a quartet, and you have only the individual parts doing that. So the stops affect that. The degree of musical control, though, is exceedingly important because, and I'm playing on these pipes right above us, if you play very legato, you get one kind of sound. Legato meaning connected. Without changing anything but touch, if I play very crisply, they won't even sound like the same 2 pipes or the 2 stops. And clearly, as you practice, you are able to introduce those dimensions into every single note so that you control the speech as well as the general characteristic of sound that occurs.
Let me pause for just a second, Dr. Cavarra. All right, sorry for that interruption.
No problem.
Now we can start anytime you like. And you want to start with that question?
Or whatever he was on, either
Or
one.
wherever you'd like to pick it up at.
Well, the relationship of each of the divisions is based on one octave apart. And this depended on the size of the instrument and the size of the room into which it was to go. But to give you an idea of the respective effect of the length of pipe, the lowest pipe in the organ is this one, and I'm not sure how well that's going to pick up, but it's 16 feet long. That means from the orifice of the mouth of the pipe to the top of the pipe is 16 feet. And this pipe is the foundation for the pedal division. Each of the divisions has a stop named principal. And the principal in each division determines the size of the box in which the rest of the pipes fit, and the main division for the pedal is built around this 16-foot principal. The main keyboard is built around an 8-foot principal, and that's that pipe over there, and it produces a sound 1 octave higher. And so the size of the division, and by the way, they're split on alternate sides. C is over here, C sharp is over here, and so on. So as I play up the scale, we exchange sides. The principal pipes of the smaller division is 4 feet long, an octave higher, and the principal pipes of this tiny division is 2 feet long. So the relationship of the divisions is by octave. And the size of the pipes that are on the facade determine the size of the enclosure which houses all the rest of the pipes and directly affects the character of the sound, not unlike, back to the string analogy, of the size of a double bass as opposed to the size of a cello as opposed to a viola and violin, etc. And the relationship then follows that, so that all the pipes within the division are based on that principal pitch, and the effect, you can imagine the same pipe speaking in this small division here as opposed to speaking in that great big box in the pedal organ, will immediately take on different acoustical characteristics. So the case becomes an integral part of the instrument, and what was abandoned when electricity came into play was the ability to hang pipes anywhere and everywhere without necessarily a sense of relationship. And if it didn't come from a slightly different place, the sounds are without the individual characteristics that one would expect. The biggest pipe you just heard, and the tiniest one is this rank. The top ones of which are so out of range, really, My dog can probably hear it, but I can't very well anymore. Go because the speaking length is less. First of all, the diameter is less than the size of a pencil, and secondly, the speaking length is less than 3/8 of an inch. The tonal disposition of the instrument, that is what each of these divisions does, is based very heavily on the region the organ was built, because obviously, just like speech varies from place to place, the tonal characteristics of the instrument. So that if J.S. Bach were to have been able to have made a tour of all of Europe, for example, in 1750 or 1735, he died in 1750, he would have found completely different organs in each country that he played, and with each having totally different tonal dimensions. That not only affected the kind of organs that were built, but it inspired the interrelationship between the instrument and the composer, so that the composer, being sensitive to the instrument that he was playing, was writing music of completely different characteristics in each country, even at the same time. The problem of being an organ builder is
You want to just a second and start again? Okay, I'm sorry, you were saying that
yes.
the problem.
The problem of being an organ builder is to produce an instrument which somehow or another is cognizant of these various historical dimensions, of the demands of the music, and the alternate problem is that organists approach the instrument from the point of view that I did as a youngster, expecting every organ to play everything. And when Lawrence Phelps said, you can get a string quartet together and we can read through a Brahms symphony, but you're only fooling yourself if you think you're playing a Brahms symphony. What you're playing is some of the harmonies and some of the notes, but the effect of 120 performers is not the effect of a string quartet. And it has nothing to do with how loud it is. You can't amplify it. You can't put it in a better room. You can't do anything to it. It takes all of those instruments to do that. So the organ is faced with, or the organ builder is faced with trying to balance 7 or 8 centuries of music tradition, which vary not only according to century, but according to the locale in which they were composed. And so my point earlier was, if Bach could have traveled throughout Europe and listened to the organists of all of these countries, first of all, he would have heard totally different organs. And secondly, he would have heard organists playing completely different kinds of music. And the appropriateness of the instrument to the literature is the point that's most often missed. You can go through the motions, you can play the notes, but it's why I'm personally upset with transcriptions where sounds which or music which was composed for a specific ensemble or instrument is adapted by other musicians and trying to play the same music. The most obvious being playing harpsichord music on the piano. The piano is not the harpsichord, and obviously the vice versa is also true. The whole characteristic of the sound is completely different, and to be faithful to the music, you have to be faithful to that. So the expectations have to be focused, and we were doing wonderfully when this instrument was built in 1966 and guided by a very sensitive organ builder who understood those dimensions. The farther we've gotten down the road, we're more or less, no, we are very definitely digressing from that again to great big monster instruments. The new organ that was recently installed in Salt Lake City in an adjacent building to the Tabernacle has something like 276 stops. And this is an attempt to be able to make one instrument play all those styles. But at best, it's an attempt because there is no music actually written for an instrument so big, and the larger you get, the less of the individual characteristics. So the integrity of the instrument is, in my opinion, directly related to the literature.
So what's your opinion of this particular instrument and its integrity and its ability to fill that niche?
What is amazing is that it fills the niche magnificently. If you play music of the 17th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century, early 18th century, or mid 18th century on it, it plays it as beautifully as any organ in the world. It also comes with the capability, in a sense, almost through the back door, of having a great deal of flexibility, which can be adaptable. But there's no way in the world that this instrument can sound exactly like a 19th century French organ. We can approximate and get relatively close to it, but it's an analogy of cooking comes to mind. You can approximate certain characteristic nationalistic flavors, but if you don't have all of the right parts, all of the right vegetables, all of the right spices, et cetera, you're getting close, but you're not really producing the same thing. And so what is amazing is that this instrument, while it plays, it's primarily oriented toward the North German literature. And when we say North German, we're talking really about Northern Europe. Yeah, better probably that way.
Oh my God, okay.
If that looks...
Make this microphone hide again a little bit. It's got a mind of its own.
It looks great, Ron.
Okay.
Good.
So Dr. Cavarra, how did this organ come to be?
I suppose we ought to start at the beginning.
Yes, that's...
And the beginning was that after 6 years in Roman Catholic Seminary, I decided that my real vocation was in music and not a celibate life. And the last year was in Rome, in fact. And I returned, and after much discussion and inquiry, decided that the University of Colorado was perhaps as good as any, and it allowed me to live at home and make the transition. My first year at CSU, preparing for a degree in music, was most fortuitous in that my professor and my class would make periodic visits to organs. And in the first year, which was in 1959, we visited the installation of a new organ in Denver. And I had the great good fortune to meet a man by the name of Lawrence Phelps, who later became the most important influence in my entire life. He was working for the Casavant firm and installing an organ in Denver, and apparently saw some potential in teaching an eager mind, and we sat aside for about 2 hours and discussed the nature of the organ and how he perceived it. And while almost everything he said I found was contrary to my previous beliefs and prejudices, I found that he was slowly altering my getting to the heart of the matter and changing my thinking little by little. He pointed out that all those things that I had held so important was size. I still quote that when one organist talks to another, the first question that's always asked between them is, how big is it? And the response that I now give is that I've never heard one organist ask the other one, how beautiful is it going to be? The concern is always with size, and as we know, the old pun is, size does not necessarily constitute quality. So that was the first big step in understanding the nature of the instrument as Lawrence Phelps understood it and had spent his life studying it. And I found that he was rearranging all of these prejudices that I had had little by little. And we began to discuss the appropriateness of the instrument for the literature. And his words were, there is no point of building a violin except to play violin music, and no point of building an organ except to play the great traditional literature. And then from that flows the opportunity to create new music. So this all began to resonate, at least logically, with me, in spite of the fact that I thought that every organ ought to play everything. And I realized that that was not exactly the case. In fact, it was quite the opposite. I then made a tour of the East Coast and played recitals throughout the area, and took advantage of that occasion to visit as many organs as I could possibly visit. And in the meantime, Mr. Phelps was talking about organs with having mechanical action. Up to that point, almost all organs were built with electric action, meaning that the keyboards are nothing but switchboards to, with wires connecting to the base of the pipe. And Mr. Phelps was trying to indicate to me that historically this was not possible, and B, not the best way to build organs. So the aim, actually, of my trip, while I was being paid by the Baldwin Piano Company to do these tours, was to do as much research as I could for the potential purchase of an organ here at Colorado State. We were moving into this building, which was the former library, and that move was planned and rather imminent. And in the meantime, I had met and spent hours with the Executive Vice President, Ray Chamberlain. And fortunately, Ray was an engineer. I say that fortunately because he came to the instrument open-minded, without prejudice, without all of the scales in front of his eyes, no pun intended, that I had. And we began discussing the possibility of, quote, 3 organs. And there was $90,000 to do that. Well, I knew at that point that $90,000 was not going to buy the university 3 organs. But we were able to commission 2 practice organs, one of which is still in use here at CSU, and the other we actually sold to Trinity Lutheran, or rather the Lutheran Chapel across campus next to the President's House, what was then the President's House, now the Alumni Center. And from that money, we were able to convert the second practice organ to an instrument that had mechanical action. Well, nonetheless, that left us with somewhere around $40,000, which was not going to buy an organ that would fill this room. And the intention was that this was to be the concert organ for the university. By this time, almost daily in communication throughout my trip back east with Lawrence Phelps, I found that he continued to educate me, kept reinforcing what sounded right, but I was not still yet completely convinced. And I went to see several instruments built with in the classic style, which is, I will explain in a moment. And that process slowly brought me around to understanding the true nature of the instrument, the historic instrument, that it was not an electric device hung all over wherever, but an integral instrument with a case, and each of the divisions of the organ having distinct individuality, interrelated like the parts of an orchestra, but each serving separate functions. And the result was beginning to recognize these characteristics in organs, noting that more often than not, they were never present in most American organs. And what they included was what we see before us, which basically is each of the keyboards, depending on the size of the instrument that was to be installed wherever, which was directly related to the size of the room and the musical demands on the instrument, that each of the divisions was totally independent, acoustically, mechanically, registrationally, that is to say, the stops and so on. And that, interestingly enough, it became a profoundly logical evolution based on the history of the instrument, which was that there was a large instrument in the choir loft of a church, permanently installed. We're talking about as early now as the 1200s. And the instrument, obviously, in the loft was unmovable. It was permanent. There were other dimensions to the organ that were used historically, one of them being a smaller choir organ, which was usually placed in the chancel of the church up front, where it accompanied the choir that usually sang in that area. And if one visits several of the European cathedrals and churches, this is a practice which is still used. My little grandson was born right at Christmas time 9 years ago, and at age of less than a week, we attended midnight mass in Notre Dame in Paris, and sure enough, the big organ was used, of course, for the big pompous things, but the choir was accompanied by a small choir organ. Then there was a third instrument which was used, basically the kind of thing we see angels playing on Christmas cards, a little small keyboard and a few ranks of pipes, and being carried by somebody at each end. And that was used, obviously, portably, and did accompanying work. Well, organists being a lazy lot, somebody came up with the wonderful idea that instead of having to run from the choir loft all the way down to the front of the church and then all the way back to play some little tiny instrument, if that was what was appropriate, they began building the instruments so that the portable part of the instrument could sit on top of the main organ. Thus, the organist could remain seated and play the big organ, which had no stops. It was just what you got was, you push the key and you got what you got. But then they could play on the small instrument that was above, and so obviously keyboards of different dimensions were available instantly to the organist, and what he was playing on, though, was really separate instruments. Finally, they began to recognize that the choir organ down front could have its counterpart in the balcony, and they would hang it over the rail. And this is very characteristic of big organs in big churches. And so it was played by another keyboard, and so the organist could stay in one place and play on these independent instruments. It was not until about 1500 that the Italians came up with the wonderfully creative idea. Seems so simple now, but they were writing music over what was called a pedal tone, a single note held in the bass. Well, obviously, if your hand has to hold a key down, that eliminated one of the dimensions, and some clever Italian got the idea to put a hook and eye underneath the bottom keyboard with a little rope and attach it to a pedal so that all you had to do was push with your foot. It would play that note, give you a pedal tone, and free up the two hands. So the pedal board was born, and they began, of course, expanding the compass of that instrument, and the biggest pipes in the organ went into the pedal. So now the instrument had at least 2 or 3 independent divisions. It was this history that Lawrence Phelps was trying to get across to me and helping me to understand that the true nature of the organ was this independence of individual divisions and interrelated, built according to a relationship based on the main pipes of the main division, and all of the rest fell into place. Not unlike a choir. Obviously the function of the basses is not the same as the function of the altos or the sopranos. They all have their independence, but that they must be heard. The other dimension that I learned most about from Lawrence Phelps was that the general characteristic of any great musical ensemble, and by that we can apply it to any music that you listen to, whether it's a string quartet or a trio or a full symphony or a big choir, etc., is that the musical entities that constitute, for want of a better word, the musicality that we perceive are, first of all, balance. It matters, he who sings the loudest does not necessarily win. Obviously, out of balance or from a balance, then comes the relationship of the various parts, so that the integrity of the sound depends on the cohesiveness of the sound, which is why the idea of the 3 tenors might have great appeal publicly to hear them all singing together, but you don't want any of the 3 of them actually in your choir, because clearly they're going to outshine everything else and there's not going to be any blend. The concept of balance became very important in the organ, because once the instrument was finished by the organ builder, the organist was, in a sense, stuck. They turn over the instrument to you, and the organ builder walks away, and you are left with what the organ builder leaves you. And you either can control it, it is balanced in sound, it has fusion that makes it all fit together, and that somehow or another all of that is controllable, that there is a dimension of articulation which we associate with all music. There's not a violinist in the world who would throw away his bow and not recognize, in fact, many times bows cost more than the instrument itself, because how the sound is controlled is clearly and a very integral part of this.